Hello and welcome to episode 15 of the SD.RB podcast. Today, Patrick Crowley is going to be talking to us about using Rails with legacy applications.
Once again, I'm Patrick Crowley, web designer, developer. I want to talk a little bit about something I've been doing on the side, which is messing around with doing a Rails app with a legacy site. I kind of come from a PHP background, so I have a couple projects that I built before that are running on PHP, and at this point, I wish I could just nuke them and start over. Complete Rails reboot, probably complete reboot of the front end. But I don't necessarily have, time to reboot every single site that I run or have built so far. So, So let's think about this, okay? Ideally, I think Rails is perhaps best suited for the sort of greenfield projects. Let's say you've got some idea for web app, you've built nothing before. Use Rails. You've got, think about it, got this new idea, you've got no users, you haven't invested in any code. It's kind of the best case scenario, I think, for Rails in the sense that you've got absolute freedom to explore all the really awesome features that Rails has. However, in the real world, it's a little more like this. You've got an existing site. So if you were to think about migrating that to Rails, you've got legacy content to deal with. So that means, thinking about, thinking about, okay, where is my content right now? What format is it in? Is it, let's say, XHTML compliant? Do I need to run through and clean it all up? A lot of sort of, depending on what you're trying to do, relatively heavy migration issues. You've got an existing user base you got to think about. So if you're going to migrate them from, one PHP-based web app to a Ruby on Rails-based web app, you got to think about, okay, how am I going to port user accounts, passwords? How am I going to notify users? How am I going to message this on the site? Perhaps you might take the opportunity to redo your front end. So think about a new design. If you haven't done web standards, perhaps you want to add that to the mix as well. Got to think about, okay, well, is this a good time to update my database schema? Are there things that my web app was not doing before that Rails makes very easy, et cetera, et cetera. Then you got to think about the physical server, getting it set up for Rails, installing Ruby, installing Rails, figuring out how you want to, do load balancing if you've got a high traffic site. So that's a lot to think about. So for some of these other projects I'm working on, I figured I don't quite want to go there yet. I probably will at some point, but what can I do right now with Rails with sites that I have that, have a PHP MySQL stack or something equivalent? Did my machine lock up? Awesome. Seriously? Pause? What the hell? Wow. It's like completely dead. Do you guys know? It's totally locked up. Yeah, I did. Super long time. There we go. Well, sorry about that. Yes. Apple screwed up. It's a lot of fun when your machine crashes to set everything back up. Guessing maybe it was like a power issue that just started off that whole chain of events. Okay, so let's try that again. All right, so given that for some applications you may not be able to go totally Rails at this point, or maybe it's not appropriate. So kind of, what are your options? First option is don't do anything, leave your site as is, use what you have, maybe plan for a time in the future when you can do a complete Rails reboot. Next option, obviously, is just to reboot the site, but again, you might not have time or resources to do that at the present moment. So sort of third possibility is that I'm playing around with is use Rails to kind of build a control panel that runs your site. Perhaps you have no real existing backend for your site. It's the kind of thing that developers tend not to build for themselves. They kind of focus on front-end features at the expense of sort of administration stuff on the back end. Or you might have a tool that already exists, but perhaps its feature set is poor, or you're tired of updating it. I know in my case, like once I picked up Ruby and Rails, I just don't want to use PHP ever again. So yeah, let me give you a case study here. A site called Cinnamon Treasures. It's a site that I have built over the past couple of years. It's basically sort of a web-based preservation group. It's all about saving movie theaters. So one of the kind of cool features of the site, it has a database of almost 15,000 theaters around the world. And essentially each theater gets its own homepage on the site. So you've got the name of the theater, its address, various facts about it, how many screens it has, what architectural style it's in, when it was built, some sort of description / history, photographs, and then typically a pretty extensive user comments for each theater. The kind of weird thing about this site is that when we started the site 5 years ago, there were about 100 theaters. So today there are 15,000. So what we kind of did unintentionally was create a message board with 15,000 threads. And so some of these theaters have an insane number of comments. This theater here, Grumman's Chinese Theater, it's one of the most famous theaters in the world. I'm pretty sure this one page has 1,300 comments, which is insane. I think you download like a meg of text every time you look at that page. And it's not the only one. There actually are quite a few. And I kind of feel like, William Shatner in that famous SNL sketch about Trekkies, sort of get a life, people. But it's cool. It's definitely a popular site, and it's interesting because the site actually is one of the first big sites I did 3 years ago that was completely web standards. I think there's maybe one table holding this whole thing together. So these pages are entirely content, and it turns out we have a lot of inbound links from people who are fans of particular theaters or the theaters themselves. Essentially, this site has kind of become like the Wikipedia for movie theaters. So one of the crazy things is because of that, these days, if you do a Google search for almost any theater in the United States, we wind up being one of the top 10 results. And the good and bad thing about that is we get a really just assload of inbound search traffic. So we can have 400 or 500 concurrent users on the site at any given time. And it's still on one box, and it's hurting. But anyway, so here's a rough breakdown of what the back end of this site is like. The principal development on it was again, like 3 or 4 years ago. So my skill set was kind of a different place. I think the web was in a slightly different place. So in those days, if you were a reasonably good PHP developer, for this sort of site, one choice you might make is to take an existing blogging software app that has the ability to register users, let them log in, let them comment on things, and use that as kind of a framework, to build your site on top of, if you weren't interested in building those things yourself. So as you can see on this quick diagram here, the base level is PHP MySQL. On top of that is 3 years ago at the time, fairly popular blogging software app called PMachine, sort of equivalent to movable type, if you guys are familiar with that. It's since been supplanted in PHP by a tool from the same company called Expression Engine, which is kind of directed more into the content management space. At this point, when I look at Expression Engine, and I have a project I'm working on with it right now, I just feel like it's tremendously bloated. It's proprietary. There's a lot of stuff you have to buy into. But anyway, this is the site. So it's built on top of PMachine, and essentially PMachine handles all the users, handles registration, login, commenting, and it's basically designed to support multiple blogs. So when I saw that 3 years ago, I figured, okay, well, I'll have a blog that's news about theaters. I'll have a blog that maybe are theaters themselves. So essentially taking the ability to comment on objects and mapping that to sort of a separate theater table that I developed, which is where all the information for theaters is stored. Because of the load on the site, we're using Smarty to cache most of these theater pages, so you're almost always looking at the cached version, except when you actually make a comment and it's got to re-render the page. And then there's sort of the, nice sort of web standards front end. So, just to go back to this diagram for a second, PMachine has a pretty nice control panel, so that covers stuff like administering users, so deleting users or looking for certain users, or editing or adding blog posts. But what it doesn't do is edit the sort of theater table, the theater database that we have. So the question is, what do we use to edit theaters on the site? And the answer, very, very sadly, is PHP MyAdmin, which, if you don't know it, is kind of a control panel for interfacing with a MySQL database. The reason that you really don't want to use this for editing theaters in this case is that it's really a tool for developers. And in that sense, it's really easy to do bad things, even kind of unintentionally. And most importantly, it doesn't really scale. Right now, we have basically 3 people that have access to this database. And it's been a real scale problem for us because we'd like to have more volunteers who can kind of come and update parts of the site. But I don't want to give them the password to PHP MyAdmin because they could do some really nasty things to the database. So as the traffic has kind of gone crazy because of inbound search, it's been a real problem. And I've always wanted to develop a PHP-based control panel for editing theaters, but in terms of all the tasks we had to do for this particular project, that was not the most important thing. Personally, I was busy with other projects that I thought were a little more significant. And mainly this thing, which is I never want to write PHP again. So although I could do it, the idea of sitting down for multiple weekends in a row and cranking out an admin tool in PHP just wasn't very appealing. So I kind of pushed it off for a year or two. So here's my experiment, basically doing this in Rails. Here's the current site. You've got the database. It's built on top of it. So just kind of split that in half. Let's just do a separate Rails app, which will be the control panel tool to edit theaters. And basically cross your fingers and hope the internet is fast enough to keep up with having this whole separate Rails site on a different server accessing the database remotely. But for what we're doing, I think it's probably sufficient. So with that said, let me kind of show you what it looks like. Let me boot up Rails. Okay, so here's the tool. I've kind of named it Roxy, which happens to be the name of sort of a legendary theater exhibition showman. And it's also the name of a theater that's since been destroyed, but once was one of the largest single-screen theaters in the world. It had about 6,500 seats. So if you compare that to your local multiplex or megaplex, it's pretty massive. So this is sort of the homepage for Roxy. It's pretty basic, just telling you kind of what you can do and showing you a list of theaters that have been recently added to the site. You can see here we've got a couple duplicates, so let me just pop in and take a look at one of these. So this is a pretty simple interface. I didn't spend that much time making it, jazzy, but it's pretty straightforward. The markup is really clean. It does the job. You've got labels for fields, the fields themselves. You have some tool tips on the side that tell you kind of what to do. You can come in, edit all this basic information. So edit the name, the description, whether it had previous names in the past, number of seats, number of screens, where it's located, perhaps some contact information. It has a photo, you can work on that stuff. Perhaps it's a landmark, so you can put in some information about its landmark status, who contributed to this entry, and then down here some sort of Ajax-y stuff for adding related architects. So it's kind of nice. You kind of add a bunch of these. And this really helps because I think we have perhaps like 1,000 theaters, 1,000 architects in our database. So trying to do this with like a pull-down menu would be really painful. So same thing with theater chains. So kind of nice, some basic, Ajax Rails integration. So I came to this theater though because it looks like it's a duplicate. So I'm going to go ahead and delete it. So we'll click on that. Kind of get a confirmation page. I'll go ahead and say, yeah, I want to delete it. So now it's gone. We go back to the theater homepage and see we have one less duplicate. But I'll nuke the next one as well. Same thing. Okay, so you get that. It makes perfect sense. This is sort of the main kind of theaters page. You can browse theaters by newest added or most recently updated. You can kind of paginate through all that, which is kind of nice. You can also go and add a new theater directly. This is kind of nice because already on the site we have a PHP-based tool for adding theaters that people use. Because the site is primarily user-generated, but it's nice to have this built into the admin tool as well. Up top here, you can see some basic navigation. This basically represents the objects in the Cinema Treasures universe that we're modeling. So, of course, you have theaters, but you also have these sort of related things, architects, so you can browse those. You can add new ones. And so we have the same thing with theater chains, architectural firms, function, what function is a theater used for currently, and architectural styles. And most of these are sort of the, has and belongs to many variety. So it's nice because a lot of this code replicates. So the cool thing about this is, right now I'm just running this against a local copy of the Cinema Treasures database, which I've been doing for development. But as a proof of concept, I can just go to my database YAML file and swap that out with the actual real live database and play around with it. So to do that, I'm going to, yes. All right, so guess I'll be changing the password soon. All right, so I've rebooted Rails here, and now I'm going to reload Theater's homepage here. And we should, okay, so we got a different set of theaters. So this is actually running off the live site. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to jump down to the theater we were just talking about, the Grumman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood. And I haven't really done any kind of performance tuning on this, so there's no caching. So it's a little bit slow here and there. So let's go ahead and take a look at this page right now on Cinema Treasures. And you can see what I was talking about with the comments. It's sort of crazy. Although that's not a good example. There's actually one that's... Is this one longer? The internet is thinking. Well, I'll kind of bag that for a second. Okay, so again, this is Grumman's Chinese Theater. We've got the live version kind of going. So I'm going to go ahead and change this just for a moment. I really shouldn't be doing this, but who cares? This takes kind of a while to update because one thing it's doing is it's actually going and nuking the Smarty cache for this page and then redrawing it and saving it back out as a cache page. Hopefully I can speed that up a little bit. So if we reload, it should say something else. All right. So I better go back and change that. So this might take a second, but just from my point of view, this is just tremendously exciting because using PHP MyAdmin was really sort of a bad idea that we just kind of fell into, and like I said, it really has been a particular point of failure in terms of scaling. So I know that our current volunteers and future volunteers will be really excited to use this tool. And okay, so quickly, I'm not going to get too much into the issues of integrating Rails with a legacy app. Some of them are kind of straightforward. Oops. Okay, so first issue that I ran into is the database schema that I have right now is a little bit different from what Rails expects. The philosophy of Rails is convention over configuration. So Rails expects your DB table names to be plural. So it's expecting theaters, but our table is called theater. So you can specifically set the table name in your class. I think it's just set underscore table underscore name, some value. But I think what I did was disable pluralization in the environment RB file. So you can see here, active record base, pluralized table names equals false. So in that case, it falls back to, I guess, the singular model name. In this case, that worked fine for me. So the next issue I ran into was that just by habit, with what I developed 3 years ago, my join tables for things like associating architects with theaters or styles with theaters had primary IDs. And generally that's something that Rails encourages you not to do. And for certain things, you really kind of have to get rid of those unless you kind of want to go out of your way tell Rails that they're there. In my case, I really had no need for them. They were just sort of newbie MySQL leftover, just kind of, oh yeah, I need a primary ID. Let me add that. And I was able to nuke those safely from my sort of local test database. So I'm assuming it's not going to be a problem with the existing app, but I will have to kind of look out for that. I mean, I've kind of searched through my code to make sure that I'm not using any primary IDs for that, but I'll probably test that a little bit more thoroughly before I deploy. So the third thing was, I mentioned this before, all the theater pages are cached, so it's a little bit tricky to get the Rails app to tell the PHP app, hey, go ahead and delete this template. The way I wound up doing that was already we kind of had a sort of a simple kind of query path hack where you could take a normal theater page URL and add some stuff to the end that would force an update. It would nuke the cached page and re-render it. So this is essentially calling that same thing, except that it's not. I think it's calling it via curl. So I just give it a nice URL and it goes and it touches the site and the site knows, oh yeah, go delete the cache. And I don't have to actually. I've customized that a little bit, so it's not trying to pull down the entire page via curl, because that would get kind of nasty for some of these longer pages. But those were the three real things I ran into. Otherwise, it was just straightforward, building a Rails app. So quickly, how long did this take? Let's say a week to 9 days or so. I started this in RubyConf, just kind of screwing around while I was listening to talks. It was never something I spent that much time on, just a few hours a day here and there. So I think for that amount of work, for, 20, 30 hours of work, I think it's pretty nice to have a complete, robust, control panel that our volunteers can use to edit the site. So lastly, I want to say this slide, I guess, disappeared when I rebooted. The kind of cool thing about this is I think it's a neat way to kind of intervene with projects that have certain limitations or kind of have gone off track slightly, in the sense that, like I said, you may not have time to do a full Rails reboot just yet, but, with maybe a weekend or week of work, you can significantly improve your existing situation. And the other kind of cool thing about that, if you think about it, is I've already spent quite a lot of time modeling my problem domain, building models for cinema treasures, building admin code. So theoretically, going to a complete Rails reboot of the site from what I have right now wouldn't be that hard. So perhaps this is maybe 30% of the work required to do that. I mean, I have more ambitious goals for the Rails reboot of that site, but it might be kind of a cool way to integrate Rails into stuff you're doing just kind of as a side project, and then kind of as a proof of viability that Rails is the awesome thing that it is, and that it scales, so to speak. It seems like kind of a neat way to do things. So anyway, any questions?
Just a sort of technical thing. So you can use the through directive when you're, as opposed to removing IDs on join tables.
Okay, sure.
I don't know if that's commonly used or not, or if.
Yeah, that's, I guess, for right, kind of stacking more data onto the joins. So.
But in this case, it might have saved you some effort.
Sure. Yeah, in this case, it was just going to the tables and deleting the IDs. But and going forward, I mean, if I don't really need, if right now anyway, there's no additional express relationship between a theater and architect or some of the other things, so it would have been overkill. But I might explore that down the road. All right.
That concludes this episode of the SD.RB podcast. See you next time.